Hi, everyone, and welcome to the third installment in the Biodiversity Caucus webinar series. This webinar is part of Nova Scotia's second annual Wetlands Appreciation Week. There are many other fun events going on this week that you can also take part in. To view the full event schedule, visit the Ecology Action Center's website, which we'll now paste into the chat for your reference. I'd like to start off by acknowledging that this virtual event is being hosted in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. This territory is covered by the Peace and Friendship Treaties of 1725. The treaties did not deal with the surrender of land, but did set out the rights and responsibilities that settlers and Mi'kmaq people owe to one another. As such, we are all treaty people. My name is Brianna, and I got involved with the Biodiversity Caucus through my role as program coordinator with the Nova Scotia Environmental Network. NSCN is a network of about 46 environmental organizations across the province, whose common purpose is to conserve and enhance the natural environment and build a sustainable future for Nova Scotia. We strive to support, strengthen, and promote the environmental work of our members by connecting them to each other, to governments, and to the public. This webinar series is an initiative brought to you by our Biodiversity Caucus. If you're unfamiliar with the concept of a caucus, it is simply a recurring series of meetings between those who share a common environmental priority, in this case, biodiversity. One of the most effective ways for NSCN to connect members of the environmental community is through the formation of environmental caucuses like this one. Caucus members join monthly meetings with those working in, volunteering in, or interested in issues related to biodiversity. At a caucus meeting, you can expect to network and learn about current and upcoming biodiversity-related projects, programs, and events from across the province. The main purpose of these meetings is to promote collaboration and advance biodiversity work in Nova Scotia. Anyone who is passionate about protecting biodiversity can join, whether you're a representative from an NGO, an Indigenous organization, or a government body, an academic, or simply someone eager to make a difference. You are welcome to participate in the group. We are actually having our monthly caucus meeting right after this webinar from 2 to 3 p.m. So if interested, feel free to take note of the Zoom link we're about to share in the chat. We also reshare it in the chat at the end of the webinar. If you're already convinced, you can complete our short interest form using the link we're also about to enter into the chat. So now I'm very happy to welcome our two guest speakers, Jess Lewis, Conservation Coordinator at Nature Nova Scotia, and Mike Kofahl, Staff Lawyer at East Coast Environmental Law. Jess was raised in Newfoundland and is passionate about botany and ecology. She studied plant science at Dallas University and researched wild bee populations in blueberry fields. At Nature Nova Scotia, she leads species at risk and sustainable forestry projects, which we will discuss in more detail today. Mike graduated from Dalhousie University's law school in 2017. He worked with East Coast Environmental Law as a pro bono student during his time in law school before joining the team as a coastal research coordinator and now staff lawyer. His practice primarily focuses on marine and coastal law issues, such as marine protected areas and wetland stewardship. Mike also loves spending time outside and is passionate about nature. I know I am very excited to hear both presentations, so with that, I'll hand it over to you now, Jess, for the first presentation.
Thank you. I'm just gonna share my screen. Hopefully everybody can see that. Present. Okay. Am I good? Thumbs up. Thank you. All right. So yeah, like Brianna said, I'm Jess Lewis. I'm the conservation coordinator from Nature Nova Scotia. That's pretty much the only thing you need to remember. I'm currently running a mainland moose research project, and it has a really big community outreach component. It includes events, a public opinion survey, and then a trail camera stewardship program. So I'm going to provide some links at the end of the chat to show how to get involved. But today I'm going to be talking about wetlands specific to Nova Scotia, as well as the use of these wetlands by mainland moose. So mainland moose are endangered. Population estimates are numbering somewhere between 300 and 700, depending on which source you look through. And I want to clarify that this is a separate species than the Cape Breton moose, which was an introduced subspecies from Alberta. There's always a lot of confusion around that one. So yeah, I'm gonna just get into what is a wetland. So Nova Scotia uses the Canadian wetland classification system, which recognize the 5 general wetland types. So you can see they're all labeled here with the best pictures I could find to describe them. But I want to note that a lot of these wetlands experience changes in hydrology over their lifetime and also in seasonality. So when we're describing these wetlands, it's kind of generally speaking the description. So things can change essentially. I'll start by describing a marsh. So marshes are shallow, open water, and they have emergent vegetation like rushes, bulrushes, and cattails. We also have salt marshes. So salt marshes, as per the name, they usually contain salt water. And this is because of their position near the ocean. So usually it's behind barrier beaches or in estuaries. Then we have the bogs, fens, and swamps. So these have acidic, mossy floors with varying degrees of open water and tree cover. Um, Bogs, fens, and swamps usually occur together, but there are slight differences. So a bog will receive most of its water from precipitation. So, and it also has deep mats of accumulated peat moss or sphagnum, and then some low wetland adapted shrubs. Fens are interesting because they resemble bogs with streams moving through them. They're ground or surface water fed. So it's a good way to identify them as if you see kind of a stream running through or some slow moving water. Swamps are similarly peaty and poorly draining, but they have over 30% tree cover. And then vernal pools, which are my favorite kind of wetland, are often found in forests, and they experience like extreme seasonal changes. So in the spring, you'll have pools of water in the forest, and then in the summer, it'll completely dry out. But it's some of the best places to find like breeding amphibians, like salamanders, and other really cool kinds of wetland wildlife. So, where can you find these wetlands? So, Nova Scotia is 360,000 hectares, and 6.6% of the total land area is freshwater wetlands. And then a much smaller 0.3% is salt marsh. These wetlands provide an estimated 7.9 billion worth of ecosystem goods and services to Nova Scotia annually. So you might see this map here. This was a province-wide wetland mapping project completed by the Department of Natural Resources in 2004, and it'll serve as the basis for wetland mapping in Nova Scotia today. It used a series of aerial photographs, satellite imagery, as well as ground truthing to locate and classify wetlands. So as a whole in the province, the majority, according to this inventory, the majority of wetlands are peatlands, so bogs and fens. These are usually found along the coast. They form headwaters of many inland watersheds. So those are the most common. Then we have swamps, which are found across the province. Then we have salt marshes, which are found in coastal areas with particularly large salt marshes in the Fundy and Annapolis coasts on southwest Nova Scotia. Our rarest type of wetland is a freshwater marsh or a large floodplain. So these are usually found in Nova Scotia adjacent to calm lakes and along the inland portion of rivers. I sent the link to Cass, so I'm hoping she posts in the chat, but it's a link to where you can find this map. And there's actually a lot of cool features to it. It's not just for wetlands. You can select different kinds of ecosystems that you want to look at, and it just gives a good idea of what Nova Scotia looks like. So this map, like I said, was completed in 2004. So it might need a bit of updating. Specifically, it might need improved methodology for detecting small wetlands, like the vernal pools I was talking about. They're probably underestimated in this inventory just because of like the seasonal changes they experience. And this can kind of make it more difficult for municipalities and the public to make plans for wetland management. So after all this, what's the connection to moose? So wetlands are really important for a lot of reasons. They improve water quality, they help with flood protection, erosion control. They're part of a healthy ecosystem. They store carbon. They also have recreational usage, as well as habitat for a lot of species. They're considered ecological hotspots. So they contain lots of different animals, but one of the more surprising tenants would be the moose, which is the largest species of the deer family. Moose are found across Canada and they utilize many different habitats, but in the summer, moose will extensively use wetlands and they'll generally avoid dense forests, preferring to feed on vegetation around marshes, shallow lakes, and swamps. So when looking at moose habitat requirements, moose require wetlands and they utilize this habitat to escape heat. They also are looking to escape insects, predators, and competition from other species. But one of the biggest reasons is moose are adapted to cold climates. So they experience heat stress at temperatures as low as 17 degrees Celsius in calm conditions and 24 degrees Celsius in windy conditions. So they're not very heat tolerant. They'll actually go into a wetland or a shallow lake to cool themselves, and the cooling opportunity allows them to continue to feed during the summer. As climate change is leading to rising ambient temperatures, moose are increasingly reliant on wetlands for cooling, and the response of the province to the impacts of climate change on wetlands specifically and potential wetland loss remains uncertain. Wetlands with open water receive some protection, and I know Mike's going to get more into the different levels of protections and buffer zones in his presentation, but I just wanted to mention this because this open water protection primarily is for supporting wetlands near forestry operations. So ideally we would see more buffers and buffers are essentially like vegetative cover surrounding the wetland. We would like to see more of this because it could provide winter habitat and shelter for predators in extreme weather in the case of the moose, but it's also really important for the wetland itself. The lack of these standards and kind of like the confusion surrounding them can actually place a bit of a burden of implementing best practices on individual municipalities and landowners. A lot of these buffer sizes, they kind of vary depending on the wetland type and then the type of the development, and then you have to think of the future pressures. This can make it really hard for individuals or smaller towns to navigate. So our stance on it is that efforts to restore damaged habitats may actually help moose. Well, we know it will help moose populations recover. This includes rewilding roads and other corridors that could prevent the parasite transmitting deer from encroaching on moose territory, or could prevent predators from being able to access them. The recovery of the mainland moose population requires establishing large protected areas with healthy forests, but also wetlands that are essential for their survival. So on more of a lighthearted note, this slide's called Love Island, and I'm not talking about the show. So moose will use islands as calving sites. They'll also use like secluded peninsulas and locations like that, but during the rutting season, a male moose will actually dig a pit called a wallow, and they'll fill these mud pits with urine, which attracts the cows, and then the wallow's scent will signal to females that the male is ready. Kind of a gross but cool fact for me. Once the cow is ready to give birth, when I say cow, I mean female moose, of course. they'll utilize these secluded island areas, peninsulas, and shrubby shorelines. These calves are safer on these sites because they're actually helpless at birth, and they're really vulnerable to predators. In Nova Scotia, the main predators would be black bears and coyotes. There's also the threat of poaching, so it makes them a bit safer there. After about 3 days, the calf is up and running, and they can actually swim and follow their mother on long swims. And from there, things just start rolling. The calf will gain weight incredibly fast. During the first month, they can gain more than half a kilogram a day, but later they'll begin to put on more than 2 kilograms a day for a time until they're fully grown. So these calves will stay with the cow on their island retreat until she calves again in the following spring. At that time, she'll actually drive off her yearlings, which is most likely a difficult experience for the yearling moose, but well, they're gonna have to get over it. So next, I wanted to talk about food requirements and how moose use wetlands for food. So moose are very large. They can weigh around 1,300 pounds. And male moose actually develop antlers, so these antlers can span up to 6 feet or more. And they have to regrow these antlers yearly. So to sustain the size, they can consume anywhere between 20 kilograms to 30 kilograms of twigs, leaves, shrubs, upland plants, and water plants daily. Good feeding conditions are crucial for antler growth as well as for pregnancy and calf growth. Studies show that twins are often born when food is abundant, and access to submerged and emergent aquatic vegetation contains specific nutrients that they need. I'm talking about sodium, iron, and phosphorus and manganese. So moose will actually dive more than 5 meters for food on a lake bottom, and they'll continuously eat this during the summer months. Habitat connection and the core habitat map. So since this is kind of a legally themed webinar, I wanted to chat quickly about the judicial review, which happened in 2019. So the Nova Scotia Supreme Court Justice ruled that the province had failed to meet its legal obligations to protect species at risk. The court then ordered the Minister of Lands and Forestry to fulfill these duties. This ruling led to the 2021 recovery plan for the mainland moose, as well as 6 other endangered species or species at risk. In this recovery plan, staff created a core habitat map. Core habitat refers to specific areas of habitat essential for the long-term survival and recovery of endangered or threatened species, and these areas are designated under the relevant legislation. The core habitat for the mainland moose shows significant overlap with wetland areas. The recovery plan did consider wetlands as calving sites when creating this core habitat map. I specifically want to narrow in on the Chignecto Isthmus, which is the connector between New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. When I was looking at the wetlands inventory map, you can see that this is majority bog habitat. So I think it identifies as key habitat for moose, and it's also bog habitat. So that's a really important connection, as well as this area is crucial because it's the only area of genetic flow between New Brunswick and Nova Scotia for the mainland moose. I also wanted to note that core habitat is not officially designated yet, but we hope to see that come to fruition in the future. So how can you help? Like I said, we have our trail camera stewardship program. So folks are setting up trail cameras on their private woodlots or properties, and they're monitoring for species. So we haven't seen any moose yet, but we have seen a lot of different types of wildlife. We've seen snowshoe hare, coyotes, we've seen lots of deer, of course, and then we've actually seen 3 golden retrievers, which were off leash running around on someone's property. So there's definitely interesting sightings, that's for sure. You can also complete our public opinion survey. There's a chance to win prizes, but it's also a really great chance to have your opinion heard on how you think the mainland moose should be protected and what you think the next step should be. You can write to your local politicians, and you can also advocate for better wetland protections. In addition to all this, you can report moose sightings on the DNR hotline website. So I'll post that link in the chat after, but it's a good resource if you think you've seen a moose, or if you've seen a moose footprint or scat, things like that. You can report it all. And that's it for me. So thank you so much. I have our socials and our website there, but I'm sure you would be able to find Nature Nova Scotia online. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jess. I do ask that everyone saves their questions till the end, again, during the Q&A period, but in the meantime, we'll move right away to our next presentation. So take it away, Mike.
Thank you. And I'm just gonna, let me maybe give me a thumbs up to make sure that you can see that. Oop. Now I can't see my own screen. Let me try this again. How's that?
We can see it.
Perfect. I can't see anyone else, so. All right, well, I'll get right into it then. As mentioned, I'm a staff lawyer at East Coast Environmental Law, and I'm gonna kind of introduce some of the policy and legal tools that are available to conserve wetlands in Nova Scotia. Just a quick land acknowledgement. I am coming to you from Unama'ki, which is part of the traditional unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Mi'kmaq people. These territories are all covered by treaties of peace and friendship that were entered into in the early 18th century with the British. And I just want to flag that I'll be speaking to very much colonial or settler laws today, but I think it's really important to be mindful that those aren't the only laws that impact the stewardship of wetlands in Nova Scotia. And in fact, there are much older and more developed laws that have been in place here for centuries that we should always be mindful of and are a key part of the puzzle when we think about conservation of wetlands and other uses of the land. Just a quick introduction to East Coast Environmental Law. We're an environmental law charity, and we provide environmental law services throughout Atlantic Canada. So for example, we provide legal education and public resources. We do advocacy and law reform, and we work with communities and organizations to support their work. And you can check out our website at www.ecolaw.ca, and I'll provide a link at the end of the presentation. So yeah, so just a quick overview then. I'm not going to cover everything there is to know about the law and the policy covering wetlands. I'll be focusing on provincial legislation and policy in Nova Scotia, and I'll mention some other things. So I'll mention some public and municipal tools, but just briefly. And so I'm just going to touch on some of the key kind of regime pieces or regulatory tools that are available. Next slide, please. So as a starting point, the Nova Scotia Department of Environment and Climate Change is the primary or one of the primary provincial departments responsible for managing wetlands. And the reason I say that is because they are responsible for, and the minister is responsible for, the Environment Act, the Nova Scotia Environment Act, which actually sets out or provides for a lot of the protections I'll be talking about today. The Environment Act also provides the definition for wetland in a law, and you'll notice that as part of that definition there's marsh, swamp, fen, or bog, that reference. You'll also notice that vernal pools are not mentioned in this definition explicitly, but it potentially could still include vernal pools. The wetland conservation policy also deals with wetland conservation, including wetland alterations. But I'll speak to that a little bit more later in the slide presentation. So one of the most important pieces of law or policy that relates to wetland protections is wetland alterations. And so under the Environment Act, the activities designation regulations actually require that anyone wanting to alter a wetland or alter the flow of water in a wetland to get approval from the minister or someone who's been designated by the minister. So an alteration of a wetland is not actually defined in law, but there are some policies at the provincial level that indicate that it includes infilling, draining, or flooding of a wetland, or excavation. Rehabilitation can also require an approval, and basically it's generally, if you're developing or intending to go do something that's going to disturb a wetland, you're going to need approval from the minister. If someone receives an approval, they have to comply with all the terms and conditions, and failing to do so, or failing to get an alteration approval altogether, can be a violation of the Environment Act and can be prosecuted by the province. Nova Scotia Environment also makes public all of the wetland alteration approvals on its environmental registry, so that can be a really important and powerful tool to getting information about potential alterations and making sure that alterations are actually approved before they begin. Next slide, please. Another really important piece of the puzzle in terms of wetland conservation is environmental assessments. Also created under the Environment Act, require certain types of projects to be registered for an environmental assessment, and specifically any project that disrupts 2 or more hectares of wetland. Now there's some difference of opinion or differences in interpretation of what that actually means. So our understanding of the province's approach to this trigger is basically if a project will actually impact a total of 2 or more hectares of wetland. There are, however, alternative interpretations. So we would see this trigger as being a project that impacts a wetland that is 2 or more hectares in size. So whether it's the full 2 hectares of that wetland or a piece of that wetland. There is actually support for our interpretation. So for example, New Brunswick has this same provision, so a trigger of 2 or more hectares of wetland being disrupted. And in that province, our understanding is that the province, if it sees that a portion of a wetland of that size or greater is impacted, it would trigger an environmental impact assessment process in that province. So it's still an open question in terms of what actually is the trigger. The other kind of really important and open-ended question in terms of environmental assessment in Nova Scotia is this idea of wetland networks. So if you have a number of different wetlands, all of which are less than 2 hectares in size, but in total are more than 2 hectares in size, would that trigger an environmental assessment? And so that's also a live issue in terms of wetland protections in Nova Scotia. Next slide, please. So Jess had mentioned buffers and setbacks. I'm not going to get into great detail, but I've provided some information on some of the key buffers and building setbacks. So for example, the on-site sewage disposal system standard, also created under the Environment Act, requires a 30-meter horizontal setback of a sewage system from a wetland. There are buffer zones called special management zones required for forestry operations. And then I'll also note that there is a lot of potential for municipal governments to play a role in setting the course for wetland stewardship. So the provincial government actually delegates a lot of power around land uses to municipalities. And so there's a lot of potential for municipalities to use their powers over both land uses and things like drinking water zones or parks in the municipalities to dictate the uses of land around and near wetlands and create buffers from those wetland areas. We'll take the next slide. Another really important feature of the Environment Act is the prohibitions related to release of substances. So these prohibitions are quite general, and they relate to release of substances into the environment general, but that obviously includes wetlands. And so those 2 aspects of the provisions. The first is whether so the first is if a person is releasing a substance into the environment that's at a concentration level, etc., that may or will cause an adverse effect, that is prohibited, except for certain approvals or exemptions. And the second would be if someone releases a substance in an amount, concentration, etc., that's in excess of regulations or an approval, and in that case the prohibition doesn't require any adverse effects. If it's above that concentration, it's in contravention of the Act. So that's another really important feature of the Environment Act regime that has consequences for wetlands. Next slide. So I am going to focus just quickly on the Fisheries Act, which is actually federal legislation, and it's actually Canada's oldest legislation, and a really important piece of the federal regime in terms of environmental protections. And when we're talking about wetlands, there's potential for fish and fish habitat to also be impacted. So the Fisheries Act prohibits any person from carrying out a project that would result in a HAD, or a harmful alteration, disruption, or destruction of fish habitat. And so if that happens, the best place to contact, if you think that has happened, the best place to contact is DFO. The Act also prohibits release of deleterious substances into waters frequented by fish, or in an area where that would result in the deposit of that substance into such water. This is actually the responsibility of Environment and Climate Change Canada. So if you ever think that there's a potential for this happening or to happen in the future, you can reach out to that federal department. DFO also has a public registry under the Fisheries Act. It's not well maintained at the moment, but there are some limited records around permits and authorizations. There were amendments in 2019 that make this public registry a requirement, but they're actually not enforced, but we do expect those to be enforced in the future, and then you'll be able to have more, hopefully a substantial access to some of these records that are really important in understanding, like, has someone actually gotten these approvals? Are they doing the things they're doing in fish and fish habitat within the law, within the bounds of the law? Next slide, please. So I just want to talk a little bit about ecosystem and species protection and lay the groundwork for that by noting the wetland conservation policy. So this was released in 2011, and its purpose is really to guide decision making broadly, and so it deals a lot with wetland alterations, but it can have potential implications or guide decision making under other provincial laws. So the goal of the policy is to prevent the net loss of wetland, and that's a really important language in there. So thinking about the totality of wetlands in Nova Scotia, or as Jess mentioned, kind of an inventory of wetlands. And the goal of the policy is to prevent no net loss. So recognizing that perhaps we lose some wetlands in some places, but we make that up in other places. There's also some really important objectives under that goal, including no loss of wetlands of special significance. And note the slight difference in language here. It's not about preventing net loss, but actually preventing loss of any of those wetlands. And then preventing net loss in area and function of other wetlands. So wetlands other than wetlands of special significance. And this is really important as well, because it's not just about the area of wetlands in total, but some of those functions that Jess alluded to earlier in terms of carbon sequestration and water filtration. And so that's a really important piece. It's not just area, but also function. And then just briefly, there's a number of different types of wetlands of special significance that have been identified in the policy. And so, for example, salt marshes, wetlands known to support species at risk provincially and federally, etc. Next slide, please. And so I've just highlighted some of the key provincial and federal laws that potentially could be a means of protecting wetlands. The focus of these laws is not just to protect wetlands, but they could be used as tools to protect land that includes wetland ecosystems or species that rely on wetlands, like the moose. And if you go to the next slide, I do have a connection or tie into Jess's presentation. So as she had mentioned, there was a case that dealt with the mainland moose as an endangered species under the Endangered Species Act, the provincial one. So the mainland moose has been listed as endangered under that act since 2003, and as a species, an endangered species under that act, the minister has to appoint a recovery team and prepare a recovery plan for the mainland moose. Now, I believe the recovery plan was appointed, I think 2004 or 2005, and a recovery plan was also created. but a recovery plan has to include identify habitat and also recommend areas that are potential areas for designation as core habitat. And so there was some ongoing concern that the province wasn't meeting its requirements and obligations under the Act. And so a court case was launched that came to conclusion in 2020 at the Supreme Court of Nova Scotia level. And essentially the court found there that the government was not meeting its obligations under the Act. And so the mainland moose was one of 6 species that were representative species for all of the species listed under the Act. And essentially the court found that there was no, the department had not identified core habitat in its recovery plan. And so that led to a declaration that the province had to meet its obligations under the Act. And then approximately a year later, we did have a new recovery plan for the mainland moose that does provide some specific core habitat identification. And you can see there as part of that, they have clearly identified that wetland habitat is a part of that core habitat. And my last slide here, I just have some additional resources. I've pulled a lot of this content actually from, we have a resource called the Legal and Policy Tools to Protect Wetlands in Nova Scotia, the first one there that's linked. So you can check that out on our website. We also have some other really cool resources around blue carbon, and then some more specific stuff around endangered species, environmental impact assessment processes. And we have an upcoming resource on municipal wetland stewardship coming probably this fall. And finally, if anyone has more questions or specific concerns about environmental issues, we also have a free environmental law inquiry service that you can check out. That's also on our website. And we do our best to respond with information that helps clarify and makes law more accessible to folks. So thank you.
Great. Thank you both for such engaging and informative presentations. I know I definitely have some questions for you both, but I'm going to first open up the floor to anyone that may have questions. So please feel free to raise your hand or type your questions into the chat if you have questions for either Mike or Jess.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, my name is Pete Younger. I'm in New Glasgow, and first of all, I thank all of you for the work you're doing. I'm really impressed. I'm just a citizen working on trying to find ways to reduce cigarette pollution everywhere I am. And I'm working with the town of New Glasgow, who very kindly have helped me out with a few things there and with more. And for instance, we just made Ribfest the first time that it was a smoke-free zone this year. At any rate, I'd be really interested in being able to find out more about municipalities and environmental protection of waterways. I was in Vancouver for quite a long time, and in 2017 started working on this issue. And the Fraser River, the impact of cigarette butts was really profound. But then again, there are close to 4 million people living along the Fraser from Hope to Vancouver. And there are 1 million people on a much larger shoreline here in Nova Scotia. And the impact, I think, is probably a lot less. But at the same time, I would like to find out all I can about the impact that is being felt, and if any work is being done on the impact of cigarette butts on our waterways. I'm particularly interested in here, of course, the East River in New Glasgow, because that's where so much of the water from our streets winds up, and if that's carrying cigarette butts, obviously. And I was wondering if there's anybody who could help me out with anything like that.
Mike, would Peter be able to access more information through the environmental inquiry service that you guys have?
Yeah, so we do have some resources on I don't know if I had flagged any of those, but I think we have some resources on like what are the kinds of laws, municipal, provincial, federal, that would deal with water, river, watersheds, water courses. So you can check those out and browse a little bit. And then if you do want to go ahead and provide an inquiry on our website, there's like a form to fill out. You can provide more details and we can have a closer look if that's something that you can do.
Okay. Thank you.
So there is a question in the chat by Abby. Abby said, "Thank you both for such great presentations. I have been keenly following the moose recovery efforts. Is there capacity for the mainland moose to recover with the current climate trends? And is the mainland moose genetically distinct from the moose in other provinces?"
Thanks. Yeah, so I think the issue with the mainland moose is it's kind of, you know, death by 1,000 cuts. Like it's not only climate change, it's habitat loss, it's invasive species, it's parasites, it's poachers. Like there's so much going on. I'm kind of a positive person, so I hope there's going to be a recovery with the current trends, but unless we reverse a lot of the things going on in our province today, I don't think it's likely. But it really depends on the next couple years and you know, are we going to be you know, protecting more moose habitat? Are we going to be focusing on this? I think that's the big question. And there isn't a lot of research in Nova Scotia on climate change and how that's affecting moose. So it's really hard to say how much, but you know, we can pull from other studies and research projects that say it is affecting them. And the genetically distinct piece. So yeah, the mainland moose is also known as the eastern moose. There are eastern moose in other parts of Canada, but it's genetically distinct from the western moose. So the western moose is the one that was introduced to Cape Breton and lives in Alberta. From like a visual point of view, you really can't tell the difference. Like if you're seeing a mainland moose or a western moose, that's kind of the tricky part of it, but genetic analysis can prove that it's a mainland moose. Hopefully that answers the question.
Okay, so received a couple more questions, some by direct message. So Richard asked, does the fisheries legislation against the pollution of fisheries apply to coastal fisheries? Can this be used against open net salmon feedlots?
So the prohibitions in or the provisions of the Fisheries Act apply to fish and fish habitat, not to a specific fishery. So they can apply both in marine waters and potentially fresh waters or in estuaries. If there's a clear link between the fish or the fish habitat and the activity that is impacting those fish. So it doesn't really matter the fishery. It can potentially have implications for provincially regulated activities as well.
Okay, great. Another question in the chat by Kate. How do you see the Nova Scotia government's choice to abandon the Coastal Protection Act impacting wetlands? Many of us are seeing coastal infilling and new construction, and it would appear that permits are either not being acquired or are being handed out freely.
Yeah. I mean, East Coast Environmental Law and myself have been very disappointed with that decision. For folks who don't know this, the Coastal Protection Act would basically have created a coastal protection zone around the entire province. And so it would have been quite relevant for coastal wetlands specifically. And so what it would have done was it would have restricted where you could build within that coastal protection zone, and would have required certain setbacks from the coast, both horizontal and vertical setbacks. So yeah, it definitely means that certain projects, whether it's development or infilling projects, that probably wouldn't have been approved under that regime are now still being approved, which is basically the status quo for the last half a century since coastal issues and concerns around climate change were first kind of becoming publicly voiced. I think the first efforts to deal with coastal protection were done in the early 60s. So we've been doing this for quite a while, and we're still kind of stuck in this status quo.
Another question in the chat by Ken. Can you comment on NSE's new interpretation of wetlands?
Maybe you can provide a little bit more context. I'm not entirely sure what new interpretation of wetlands you're referring to.
I can. So, as I understand it, and it's been reported by Linda Pinozo, that the province has instructed staff to look at wetlands in a different way in order to see where they might be able to facilitate development to improve housing.
Yeah, so there were some there was some reporting on what the Department of Environment was calling clarifications to the way they were interpreting their wetlands conservation policy, and so the way that they were interpreting was a little bit different maybe than what we were interpreting the policy. So, for example, as I mentioned, the policy deals with wetlands of special significance and discourages or prevents alteration permits, for example, of those wetlands of special significance. The clarification of what the policy essentially says is you shouldn't be altering wetlands if they're a wetland of special significance, and there are some exemptions or some exceptions to that. One is if the project or the thing that would alter the wetland serves a necessary public function, and the definition given for that necessary public function has been broadened to include projects that provide a public service on a provincial scale, and it deals with housing, commercial, industrial uses, and renewables. So it's been interpreted as quite broad in terms of what could potentially serve a necessary public function. I suppose that the simple stance is we don't necessarily agree with that. The definition that's given in the policy does deal with public services on like a provincial scale, and obviously housing is a provincial issue, but is a single housing development on a provincial scale? Well, that's maybe up for debate. Yeah.
Okay, so another question in the chat by Sheridan. Hi, thank you for your presentations. With hurricanes happening more and more with climate change, what changes might we see in wetlands?
I can try and take this one. So, like specific to Nova Scotia, we have a small amount of salt marshes, but along with climate change and hurricanes, we're seeing like rising sea levels. So this is affecting the salt marshes. Naturally, these marshes will move inland, like that's their process. They'll slowly erode, but with development close to the salt marshes, they're unable to move in, so they're usually getting washed away. And then in the case of wetlands, with changes in precipitation, the amount of precipitation and temperature, it can actually cause changes in the water chemistry in the wetland, which could make it more difficult for some of the animals that live there to utilize the habitat they provide. So mostly negative, but wetlands store carbon, so that can help mitigate climate change.
Okay, so another question. I watched a YouTube presentation of a woman completing her master's, and she talked about the buffers from roads. stressing the fact that the most concentrated amounts of moose in the province are in the areas of 5 kilometers plus from any roads. Is there any law preventing more roads being constructed inland? I have noticed in my area, southern Nova Scotia, many people have been developing around inland lakes for cottages and homes.
Yeah, I'm not aware of, and I don't think there's any law that just outright prevents more roads being constructed. And I think there's lots of different regulations dealing with the construction of roads, depending on whether it's a private road, a driveway, a provincial road, a highway. So there's a whole bunch of laws, and I'm not familiar with all of those off the top of my head. I would say that, for example, a road would require, if it's going through a wetland, to have a wetland alteration. Depending on the size of the road, whether we're talking about, you know, a driveway versus a provincial highway, some of those projects would require an environmental assessment. It's gonna go lawyer here for a second and say it's gonna be really dependent on the specific circumstances of the road, the size, the scale, the impact of that project.
Also, Mike, if you don't mind me saying something, in the HRM in particular, in their municipal planning strategy, which kind of organizes how the HRM will be developed, they do have some policies to, this is particular for the HRM, some policies to not break up what are called wildlife corridors or greenways. So if there's a passage such as, you know, a series of wetlands that species will use to travel, they have a policy to not create new roads that would break those up. But it's hard to say if any other municipalities have such policies.
Okay, maybe there's time for one more question. So there's a quick question by Abby. Do you know why western moose were introduced to Cape Breton rather than eastern moose?
I don't know why that was the case, but I know that basically what happened on Cape Breton Island is that the moose that originally were living there were extirpated, so that means they became locally extinct. And then my guess is that the western moose was just the most readily available moose at the time, and they could kind of fly them in and drop them off. But yeah.
Okay, so we are running out of time now. So I will say if there were any questions that weren't answered, please feel free to contact us, reach out to us, and we can try and get you an answer for those questions. Cass just put the email in the chat. Thank you for doing that. But thanks again to you both for being here today and offering such interesting presentations. And thank you to everyone who attended. A recording will be emailed to everyone who registered if you'd like to rewatch it. As I mentioned earlier today, this webinar is part of the Biodiversity Caucus Webinar Series. So once we finish our call, a short form should open automatically in your browser that has the same questions as the caucus interest form I mentioned earlier. Please take a couple of minutes after the call to complete the form if you are interested in receiving more information about the Biodiversity Caucus. I think Cass already repasted it into the chat, but we are having our meeting right after this. Yeah, thank you. So yeah, feel free to join us, and thanks again, everyone.